Thank you, John, and welcome to everybody for another class. Here we go again. Glad you are all here. Somehow we needed to figure out how to give college credit for all of this, right? Some kind of certificate or something for the faithful ones coming here and participating in this class every week. We're just very glad you're here. Thank you for being here. There's a lot we're going to try to do today as we take the Reformation now across the Atlantic into America, the settling of America, the Reformation drive and values and commitments and convictions, deep convictions that drove the settlers in the early days coming here to our shores. And there's a lot to be done there, a lot that we simply can't cover tonight. So we're going to try to focus. We're going to try to see if we can learn something about this. We got started last week with Dr. Serling, just a wonderful presentation of the tangled, sometimes tortured Reformation history of Scotland, and but it was so fabulous to hear your presentation. We have Dr. Ron White here tonight also, who will be speaking next week, and I told him everything that Mark and I mess up tonight, Ron will get straightened out next week, okay? So anyway, great, what's that? Becky's back next week. Are you back? Okay, got it. Okay. All right. Good correction. Okay. Let me make a couple of announcements before we begin. I want to remind you that we are hosting here at San Marino Community Church my dear friend and mentor, a man who is very important in my life, John Perkins, Reverend Dr. John Perkins. On March 4th, he will be speaking in the traditional service. In this service, by the way, we're going to show the documentary that our son Mike, who is right there, made of John Perkins. So because John can't be in both places, we're going to show a documentary in here for the contemporary service. This is a great man. A wonderful man, a big man, a man with a big vision for his life, who comes out of pre-civil rights Mississippi, out of tremendous racial trouble, difficulties, even violence in his own family, and yet speaks such a gospel of joy, of reconciliation, of coming together, of affirmation. I have learned so much from John. We began a center at Seattle Pacific University called the John Perkins Center for Reconciliation. It's really something not to miss. I hope you all can make it to hear him when he comes to speak. One other note as we begin. We have a master shipbuilder in our midst. Tom Erickson, who is also one of the great preachers in our midst, is also a shipbuilder. And I knew that. And so I wrote him a note this week, and I said, any chance, Tom, that you have the Mayflower or the Arbella, one of the ships that the settling of early America? He writes right back, and he says, I do indeed have the Mayflower. So isn't that cool? There it is. And Tom is going to make a few remarks as we close this afternoon and talk about even the shipbuilding part of it, but talk about the Mayflower a little further. But please, at the break and any time, come up and view this beautiful piece of work, this beautiful ship. Then another note I want to say. Janet Wells, a member of our church and an active member in this class, is in the ancestral lineage of the Mayflower. How cool is that? I mean, and she knows a lot about it, and she knows, she's done the research. Well, let me tell you, I'm supposed to be in that same lineage, as are Mark and Mike and my boys. There is an Eaton on the Mayflower in signing of the Mayflower Compact, Francis Eaton. I know some things about him, not a lot about him. We need to do more research to make sure that thing is there. But my dad always said that his dad and his grandfather told him that we do come from that same line from the Mayflower, the folks who signed the Mayflower. Now, trust me, there are 35 million of us who claim to be in that lineage, so who knows, it's not so special, but I've always thought it's kind of cool. I did find out, by the way, I ran into something in the last couple of weeks, that this Francis Eaton, the ship was divided between what was called the Pilgrims. They were the Puritans. They were the ones sailing to purify the church and further the kingdom of God. And then there were what was called the strangers. So 50-50, about 50-50 on the Mayflower, the strangers. So I found out that maybe this Francis Eaton was on the strangers' side. So I've been dealing with an identity crisis all this couple of weeks since finding this out. I may be a renegade or I may be a Puritan, one side or the other. And so I've got more research to do. But anyway, so Janet and I want to know, by the way, how many of you might also claim that lineage? Yes, okay, yes, all right. 2 more. So terrific. 3, great, fabulous. So here we are, folks. I mean, this is what we're talking about tonight. I love that, and I hope I can get my identity straightened out at some point. So let's dive into our topic tonight. There's a lot that could be done here that we're not going to accomplish tonight just because there's a lot of room to cover. This Reformation, as it moved across the Atlantic, landed in on our shores in New England, and the Reformation that they brought, the convictions that they were driven by, what it is that they believed they were doing, to both to purify the church, to escape persecution, to purify the church, and then as well to establish a new society. I get so excited in reading some of this primary material where they are writing about setting up a government, forming the society. How was it they were going to operate as a new country? The vision they had for that, and so that's what we're going to cover tonight. But I thought that we would. Let's see, Brandon. What am I punching here now? What? There we go. Okay. There's the Mayflower, the Pilgrims. In 1620, the Arbella coming 10 years later to Massachusetts Bay. This is the beginning. But I thought I would, what am I doing here? I got through, oh, there we go. Got it. I thought I would give this map. I don't know whether you can see it. Never quite know with these slides whether you really can see these things. But this is extraordinary. From the time of the launching, the explosion in 1517 with Luther's 95 Theses, it all broke out from there. Of course, there was a lot going on before that, as we know by now, as we've been talking about. A lot of forces moving into this, but somehow this is a kind of symbolic launching of the Reformation. But by the time of 1600, these are the now configurations you can see. The Anglican, of course, is in England. We have got the Calvinist in Switzerland, out of Geneva, moving into the Netherlands and then moving to Scotland. We have got the Lutheran in the German states and then moving up into Scandinavia. We have got then, of course, the Roman Catholics still in Spain and France and Italy, and then in Eastern Europe. It's really quite a map, isn't it? I mean, to go this fast, with historical speed, I think is lightning speed. It seems to me to move this fast, to make this, spread this movement across Europe. And then, of course, the Reformation moves to America. We've got the Mayflower in 1620, making its way, by the way, on its way to Virginia, which really meant at that moment they were on their way down to the mouth of the Hudson, where New York is. That's where they were headed. They hit very, very tough weather, had to turn back, and they sought refuge in Cape Cod, as we know. You can see that with that line there, they had gone down and then had to turn around and circle back around, and then found refuge from the weather in Cape Cod, and then on over to Plymouth. And then, of course, then in 1630, you see just a visual image here, a small visual image of the Arbella, which was a group of 11 ships, by the way. It was the flagship of 11 ships bringing about 1,000 people into New England to establish the Massachusetts Bay colony. So I thought I would move back here and say, what is the heart of the Reformation that is launching all of this? And that's a tremendous fascination for me. With a lot of ways in which you can talk about that. We have been talking about that. But for me, it all starts in Luther's study. In the Tower, it is called, in the Augustinian monastery, the Black Cloister, by the way, it was named, in Wittenberg. And so here is Luther in 1513's poring over the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, and the Psalms, and discovering there what we now know as the Reformation. I mean, really as the Reformation, what drives the Reformation, and basically that is out of the Scriptures, out of this intense study of the Scriptures, Luther discovers grace. And I want to read just a passage here. Yes, I've selected that one. So he says, reflecting later, but he looks back and says, sitting in his study now, he lived a somewhat tortured spiritual life. You know, he was continually self-condemning, and how can I measure up, and how possibly can I measure up to God's justice, and the notion of God's justice and my inadequacies, the gap between them were just torturing to him. So he's saying, night and day I pondered over in Romans, over Paul, trying to understand what Paul is all about. Night and day I pondered until I saw the connection between the justice of God and the statement that the just shall live by faith. So it is this discovery that if only I believe, I can know that God loves me. This is the explosive discovery at the heart of the Reformation. Then I grasp that the justice of God is that righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy, God justifies us through faith. Through faith. It's through believing. We believe. Dale Bruner, in his wonderful commentary on John, the prologue of John, says, it is not genuinely believing or sincerely believing. That would suggest that you're working your way still towards grace. No, it is believing. You believe that grace is yours no matter what you do. That God's lavishly loving heart reaches out to each one of us, and we don't need to earn our way to get there. So this is it, right? Thereupon I felt myself reborn, born again, That's where we get that language, sometimes misused. But reborn, my head's turned around, my heart's reshaped by, I'm become a new person. To have gone through through open doors into paradise. The whole of Scripture took on a new meaning for me. Unbelievable, unbelievable. The whole of Scripture took on a new meaning. So new insight here, tremendous new insight, new discovery. So the world took on new meaning, he's saying. And whereas before the justice of God had filled me with hate, now it became to me inexpressibly sweet in greater love. This passage of Paul became to me a gate to heaven. And he means by that heaven in terms of one's own life right now, not just heaven beyond, although that too. So here's the heart of it. So this then exploded as we have seen the map all across Europe. Obviously, complex historical movement, I get all of that, but nevertheless, something big happened. The tectonic plates of history shifted at this moment out of this discovery of grace and by faith and not by works, and challenge to the authority of the church in that process, that I can go directly to God. And that it, by the way, is in the reading of Scripture intensely for Luther, of course, but in the personal reading of Scripture, God speaks to us and God brings that grace to us. This is the explosion that happened. This is then what our pilgrims and our Puritans tonight takes across the ocean to America. So, let's look at the Pilgrims first. That's the name that Bradford gave to them in his great, magnificent book called of Plymouth Plantation. Really one of the great pieces of literature in all of America. In terms of all of the documents, if you think about what is written about America and so forth, this is a great one of Plymouth Plantation. If you haven't read any of it, it's easy to get a very cheap paperback copy of it and just read some of this. I mean, it's so exciting to see him reflecting on what are we going to do? What is happening now? And what drives us? And what is important to us? So anyway, out of Plymouth Plantation. So let's look at these pilgrims who sailed across on the Mayflower in 1620. We know to be sure that they had already migrated. They had already left England under the threat of persecution. And they had gone to Amsterdam first and then to Leiden in Holland. And this is where then they began to plan and plot this migration to the Americas. It took them 65 days to sail the Atlantic, and it was a horrifying trip at times. I mean, you read this reflection on it. It was terrifying at times, feeling like they were going to lose everything, talking, huddling from time to time about whether they should turn back. The crew sometimes resistant and saying, we just can't do this, we're not going to make it. And they were running out of food, running out of beer, by the way, which was really a way in which they stayed hydrated. And the crew was fighting at times over their supply of beer and whether the passengers were going to get it. Anyway, all of this complex process. But they made it, 65 days. And then when they arrived, of course, the situation became even more daunting. Listen to this fact. Imagine this. Within 4 months, half of those that were on the ship died in 4 months' time. Through the severity of weather and the conditions of their food and the disease, of course, that spread through them quickly. William Bradford, as we know, became the leader, the governor for some 30 years. And then in that time, at some point, he wrote this magnificent piece of Plymouth Plantation, from which we learn a great deal. So what was the motivation? They were separatists. The Puritans, by the way, as we will see with John Winthrop later, who moved to Massachusetts, were not separatists. They wanted and felt that perhaps they could purify the church by staying put. The separatists, the Pilgrims, decided they needed to move, and they wanted to completely separate themselves from what they perceived as a corrupt church in England and the pressures of some persecution through the government in the reign of James I. So they sought freedom to purify the church, but what you end up hearing throughout this is they sought as well and crafted a vision for themselves, a story, a narrative for themselves, that they could build a new society. And I think the question for us and the fascination for us as Americans is to say, what was it that they felt they were creating as a society? What kinds of values would they build that society on? And that's what we will talk about. So here's the remarkable thing as I think through this whole thing. Yes, they were fleeing. Let me see if I can, there's the ship as we begin our journey. But yes, they were fleeing from persecution, from a corrupt church, they believed, but they carried with them a vision for something better. And in my opinion, we need to notice both sides of this. We need to think about both sides. Yes, it's separation. Yes, they were separatists. Yes, they were moving from something. But as they moved, they were moving toward a vision that they continued to create. So listen to Bradford. And this is what he says. So while still in England, they saw the evil of things in these parts, and whose hearts the Lord had touched with heavenly zeal for his truth. That was he was talking about themselves. The Lord had touched with heavenly zeal for his truth. They shook off the yoke of anti-Christian bondage, leaving it behind. That's what they believed. They were fleeing, and as the Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, into a pure church. Now, here's what he's doing. He's talking about both sides of this, into a church estate, in the fellowship of the gospel. We will watch them each step here forming the fellowship of the gospel that is driven by the gospel. What does this church community look like if love is at the center of it? You hear them all over the place talking about this. Can we do this? Is it possible to do this? To build a community, the church, the community beyond that, a society even with love at the center. Beautiful. It's beautiful. To walk in all his ways made known. Sometimes they can be a little harsh with that. His ways, God's ways, the biblical ways known. Sometimes they get as we know, and their reputation is that they created a lot of restrictions for people to live within, committed to freedom, but at the same time a lot of restrictions. The Lord assisting, let's see, I got to get in this other line too. To be made known to them, or to be made known unto them according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them. Think about the cost they put on the line here, the risk they were taking. Unbelievable. The Lord assisting them. and that it cost them something, this ensuing history will, ensuring history will declare. He adds, truly their affliction was not small. And I think we've got to take him at his word. And you hear the stories, and you hear all of the detail that he lays out in the voyage itself, but then in the arrival. This was not an easy deal. They were laying a whole lot out on the line because of these deep convictions. So what else is driving them? I mean, why else would they do this? This is the great puzzlement, I think, of the whole Puritan movement, is why else? Other than that they wanted to purify the church. Yes, they wanted to live in a community where love was the anchoring center. They wanted to build a society out of that. Right? I think that's right. I think that's what's going on here. Listen to them. We are so harsh on them sometimes. And Mark's got some things he's going to say in the second half here that they come out not looking so well sometimes. But you listen to the deep convictions that drove them into this place, and they're worthy. It's a good thing. It's a good vision. It's a right vision. It's ultimately a belief that the kingdom of God could be built here on earth as it is in heaven, right? Right? I think that's okay. And I may idealize them a little too much, but I think that's true. Stephen Prothero, a professor at Boston University, says this about the settlers. I think the Puritans are carrying with them a story. Looking back, we know we're assessing all of this. That's what we're doing tonight. They're carrying with them a story that, no, we're not just leaving because we've got kicked out of our place. No, we're not just leaving because we can't make any money in England anymore. No, some of those pressures were on them, by the way. No, we're not just leaving because everybody thinks our theology is wrong. We're leaving because we're going to remake Christianity. We're leaving because we're going to remake the world. So it gives them this sense of specialness, says Prothero. And for me, he goes on, what's happening there is the life of this idea of freedom and the power of this idea of the story of the Israelites, that we imagine ourselves into this story, which is a story that moves always from slavery to freedom. Right? Isn't that cool? I mean, this is the story adopted. This is what we imagine ourselves into in this. This is the narrative that shapes and frames their actions. It gives meaning to what they are doing. We are moving as the Israelites did, as Moses did out of Egypt. We are moving from slavery to freedom. That's a big vision. That's a big deal. And that's an anchoring notion, an anchoring story. From Egypt to the Promised Land we move, or in our telling, from England across the ocean into the wilderness of New England and New Spain and New France, and then into the Promised Land of contemporary America. He says, I think a part of America is an idea. And that's what I think we learn in rereading these people, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, is that part of America is an idea. And I think that idea is wrapped in a story. And I think the idea is about freedom. That story is always working on us. Right today, it works on us. This freedom from slavery to freedom, from bondage to freedom. Well, and so there's the Mayflower, and in 1620 they circled into the safety of the harbor of Cape Cod. And Bradford says at that point, and I love this line, they were not a little joyful. Huh? You can imagine. Indeed, he says, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean. I love that. By the way, I love this 19th century painting. But most of my visuals here come out of the 19th century, reflecting back to some really, there, you know, I mean, if you go out and Google images and put this stuff in, you get a lot of really schmaltzy, cheap stuff. But there are some great things that came out of the 19th century, reflecting back on the beginnings of America. And this particular one of the Mayflower I like so much. And this is suggests the sort of safety, the sort of new safety, the sort of coming through the horror of the voyage, and then finally finding safe harbor. But then, I like this one too. Now what do we do? And you imagine it. I mean, isn't that a great thought? I mean, there they are. I mean, some depiction of what it was like. Okay, there they are, standing around, no town square to gather in, but they're standing there saying, now what do we do? What's next? I used to be so fascinated with this as a young boy. Just thinking about the incidentals, the very practical things that they had to begin doing. We're talking November here, by the way, so we're not exactly planting time for the next harvest. I mean, this is, you know, now what do we do? Well, how do we survive? And of course, a lot of them didn't survive. Half of them didn't survive, and it was a very, very difficult time. But one of the things they did is, before they departed, before a person set foot on the soil, they crafted the Mayflower Compact. Scholar and writer who's written a wonderful book called Mayflower, by the way, which I recommend to you, Nathaniel Philbrick says, he calls it a document that ranks with the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution as a seminal American text. I think that might stretch it a little bit, but nevertheless, this is the kind of claim for this document. What an amazing thing. And what I find in this document is, and by the way, the marvelous insight they had, practical judgment they had to say, look, everybody's got to sign this before we get off the ship. In other words, the strangers on one side and the pilgrims on the other, we all need to sign this because we're not going to survive unless we can stay together. Now, isn't that a great thing? I mean, it just that one practical thing. They all had to sign. So those signatures that you see on there, they are on the Mayflower Compact. They're signing on. They're buying into. And what I find in this document is amazing. It is a vision. It is an expression of hope that they can form a society, a decent society, a good society. It is a dream. It is the hope. It is, and we will covenant together. We will compact together that we're going to stick together to do this. We're going to try to carry out this vision. Bradford himself, by the way, says of the Mayflower Compact, this is the first foundation of their government in this place. Think about that. I mean, nothing there. I mean, they don't have a government. There's nothing there. And so they draft this thing on the ship, sign it, and here they go. So let's look at the Mayflower Compact. I've got the text. It's in your handout too, but I just want to read it. I mean, it's really wonderful. So in the name of God, amen, it starts. We whose names are underwritten, Nathaniel Eaton, Francis Eaton along with them, okay? So all of these signatures, all of these, the real people, signed only by men, unfortunately, by the way, but of course, you know, we understand the culture for that, I suppose. But we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, dread, you sort of don't know whether the connotations of that word are a little loaded, because they were fearful of him. They were moving from him, and the possibilities that King James I did not like them, but they're really, it's very respectful here, I think. The dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, Ireland, King, defender of the faith. And by the way, he took on Scotland too shortly after this, or right at in fact, I think it's mentioned in the compact. But anyway, they say, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancements of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Remember, they were on their way to Virginia. Believed they were going to get, that's where they were going to settle. But nevertheless, and they had a consent agreement that's where they could, a patent that they could settle there. Do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. Sometimes the Puritans are accused very harshly about their over assertion of authority. What you find in the very beginnings here is like, well, wait a minute, we're all going to combine together. We're in a compact together. We're in a covenant together. We're in an agreement together that we are going to do that. We're going to agree to this. We're all buying off on this. There's a kind of mutuality that I think is insisted upon throughout this document and throughout so much of what they write. All for our better ordering and the preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, acts, constitutions, and offices. None of this has been done, of course, so this is what they're moving into. They're moving into a lot of work, a lot of administrative work. They're going to have to craft all of this stuff. They're going to have to put it all together. We're agreeing we're going to do this together. We're going to come together. We're going to build a commonness within our society. From time to time, these offices, constitution offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most to meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. There's some remarkable feeling about this. I love it. I think there's a sense, as we've been saying, that we've got to come together to survive. There's the pressures of even survival coming on them, but at the same time there is deep conviction within that we want to build a society where we can agree, where we can come together, where we can live in community, where we can decide these momentous things of building a constitution and ordinances, acts and laws and all of that. Parcel out the land, by the way. That was one of the big first stages. They had to divide up the land. Francis Eaton got 4 acres, by the way. In any case, the compact is saying we're agreeing to this, we're buying into this. So in witness thereof, whereof, and so forth, they sign it this day, the November 11th, 1620. From the great book, Democracy in America. Many of you know that book. By the way, if you've not read Democracy in America recently, get it and read it. It's a really magnificent thing. It's written by a French aristocrat, came over in 1830 to America to say, what in the world is this thing, this democratic thing that's happening, this democracy that's taking place in America? What is, and bringing with it the French aristocrats' glasses and looking at Americas, and he's dazzled by it, by what is going on. He's puzzled by a lot of it, curious, very curious, and writes this major book. It's just really worth reading as one of the great books in understanding of America. But he says, what distinguished these early settlers, above all, from all? This is de Tocqueville now. In the 19th century, what distinguished them above all from all the others was the very goal of their undertaking. It was not necessity that forced them to abandon their country. They left for a social position they might regret and secure means of living, nor did they come to the New World in order to improve their situation or to increase their wealth. They tore themselves away from the sweetness of their native country to obey a purely intellectual need. By the way, I would put in there a spiritual need too. De Tocqueville doesn't use that language, but an idea, driven by an idea. In exposing themselves to the inevitable miseries of exile, they wanted to make an idea triumph. De Tocqueville, one step more. It is impossible to read the beginning, all of these writings that we're looking at even today, without receiving, despite oneself, despite his own aristocratic skepticism perhaps about it. It is impossible to read it without receiving a religious and solemn impression. One seems to breathe an air of antiquity and a sort of biblical perfume. Isn't that cool? So that's one observation about what is going on in this great compact that we find on the Mayflower. But let's move on now. So we have the starving time. It was not easy. It was not easy, to say the least. But I want to read just a little bit of this. I may not read this whole thing, but this is Bradford again. This is going back to a Plymouth plantation. I stand amazed at this poor people's present condition, being thus past the vast ocean. We came across the Atlantic and a sea of troubles before that in preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before. They had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh them in their weather-beaten bodies, no homes, or much less towns to repair to see for succor. In addition, of course, and then this is a complicating factor we just simply don't have time to talk about this evening, but this is a very tortured, a difficult time in this whole time, and that was the interface with the Native Americans here. But this is the way he first imagines it and pictures it. In addition, these savage barbarians, when they met them, as afterward will appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for this season it was winter, and they that know no winters in that country know them to be sharp and violent. True, but just think, with no houses and so forth. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them we knew not. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with their weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. I put up, standing up next to this, the idealizing picture of Asher Durand, painted in 1855. Some of these paintings coming, this is called the Hudson School of Painting. Some of these paintings coming from these American landscape painters are just magnificent. But I wanted to capture here, later on in our history, the sense of the vastness of that wilderness. And even, I think, in this painting, some of its threatening aspect, which Bradford is describing in this piece we just read. So up against, but you can see that Duran is idealizing the settlement there. It's all looking ever so peaceful, and they're beginning to clear the forest for agriculture and so forth. But you've got these pictures of with two views. The one living it actually in this description, the other one then thinking back, wow, wasn't that an incredible thing they did? And wow, wasn't that a massive wilderness that surrounded them? This painting says that. Wow, wasn't it an amazing thing they were stepping into? And then the painting is suggesting, of course, that they began to do their work and to create their settlement. Well, we need to move on to the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay. And what I want to do here is to talk about a model for Christian charity, which I think is also one of those wonderful seminal documents in American literature and history. We understand, by the way, that Winthrop was not a separatist. He wanted to purify, he was a Puritan. He wanted to purify the church, but he wanted to stay within. He wanted to do it within. He did not need to separate, did not feel compelled to separate themselves in order to do this. But with certain persecution coming on them and they feeling that they believed it was time to leave, and leave they did. And so on the Arbella, the flagship of their voyage, with 11 ships altogether, lots of people, up to 1,000 people in that group, they took off on their way to New England, landing in Massachusetts Bay, ultimately what we know is the Boston area and so forth, okay? So the founding, the Puritans' founding of New England. But look at this statement now. And this is a model of Christian charity, by the way, delivered on the voyage, in the Arbella, on the Atlantic, on their way. This was a sermon delivered to everybody, so it was also crafting a vision for what they wanted when they got there. What kind of society are we going to build? This is where, this is really the primary voice, a primary voice here, speaking into this vision of what America could be like. Now, the only way to avoid a shipwreck with our whole venture, literally, I suppose, as well as, of course, they had to manage the process of the voyage, to be sure, in order to make it but a shipwreck in terms of their grand venture. And to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together. Here comes this language of community, by the way, that I think is so strong to the Puritans. It's beautiful. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man, as one person. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. Fantastic stuff, isn't it? I mean, it's like, listen, folks, we're driven by the gospel. We have got to come together in love and affection and care for one another. He keeps drumming this home. He keeps pushing this notion. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us and His own people, and will command a blessing upon us in our ways. If we do these things, if we stay together, if we have love as the anchor at the center of our church, to begin with, our community, and the world we're trying to build, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us as a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make us like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill, which become a famous line used by many of our presidents over time, by the way, in presidential speeches. We must consider that we shall become a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in his work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God, and all the professors of God for God's sake, that is, all who are believers. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So there's tremendous risk. There is tremendous risk not only in terms of practical challenges of settling, of dealing with the weather, of dealing with negotiations with the native peoples around, which, by the way, did have some good elements to it, some good things that happened. It was much back and forth in a very difficult time. But we've got all of those practical things we're dealing with, but we are dealing with measuring up to the aspirations we have set for ourselves. And that is that God is with us. We will settle a good place. We will establish a good, we will purify the church. And out of that, we will influence the world for good and for God. It was a great ideal. It was a huge one. I want to do, let's see, one more short passage from Winthrop. I got to get Mark up here for sure. We've got, so look at this one now. This comes out of the same thing. It looks like my font size went into nothing there, but framing, what does it say? Framing these affections of love in the heart. I love this passage. Listen to this. He's saying that what we have got to do is keep focused on the grace and love of God, the gracious love of God, the lavish love of God, in order to love one another lavishly as well. We need to build this into our lives as habits of our heart. Isn't that a great notion? Habits of the heart. Robert Bellow wrote a great, wonderful book by that title at one point. What are the habits of the heart that we have? Those things not imposed. What he's saying is not to impose that on the people, but that we end up being reshaped by the gospel of Christ to have these things as part of the habits of our hearts. So the way to draw men and women to the works of mercy is not by force of argument from the goodness or the necessity of the work. For though this cause may enforce a rational mind to some present act of mercy, as is frequent in experience, yet it cannot work such habit in the soul as shall make it prompt upon all occasions to produce the same effect, but by framing these affections of love in the heart, which will as naturally bring forth the other as any cause doth produce the effect. And I read this by way of saying this is the aspiration. Did they fail? Of course they failed. Do we all fail with this? Of course we do. But this was the aspiration. It was a big aspiration. It was a big hope for their community, that we can in fact live in brotherly and sisterly love, that we can come together, that we can care for the poor, the afflicted, the needy among us. This is all in there. This is all in the vision. This is all a part of the foundations on which they built and move forward. I was going to read a marvelous passage from David Hall, by the way. If you have not seen, he's a good friend of Mark and Victoria's, good friend, comes out to the Huntington, professor of Harvard Divinity School, does a lot of his research at the Huntington, but he's written a marvelous book called Reforming People, and what he is giving is I believe, a refreshing new view of the Puritans. Saying we are too harsh on them. In fact, look at the way the whole society unfolded, by the very way in which they divided up their land even, by the way in which they treated those who got out of line. It was much more merciful than we often have created in the mythology of the Puritans. Now, Mark's going to talk about some places where they were harsh indeed, and they were indeed. But I think David Hall has just convinced me so much that if you look at the details, it was equality, equitability, impartiality. Such were the values each town and colony tried to follow in the yearly exercise of setting rates and taking money and appropriating land and all of this, all of the mechanics of building their government. Either as principle or as practice, privilege had given way to the rules aligned with fairness, equity, and justice. Now, this is a historian talking from the details of all of the records of council meetings and contracts and all of this sort of thing. What Winthrop was talking about took place. It happened. They carried it out. Not always with success, of course, with lots of failure. We come down hard on them when that happens, but it did in fact happen. Well, let me close. Mark has given me just a little bit over the hour, and then we'll take a little break, and then Mark will come up with a story. Buried in Bradford's of Plymouth Foundation, plantation. Is the story of Marymount. This was a story of, and he spends a lot of time on this, thinking about it. This was a story of one aberration that happened within the Pilgrim community. So they're trying to build a community abiding by these principles and so forth, and this Thomas Morton breaks off and really founds his own colony, his own little village, centered around a maypole, by the way, which was an in-your-face celebration of springtime out of pagan culture, deep in pagan culture, and they would dance around the maypole. They were a hippie commune is what they were, okay, in that time. Lots of booze, lots of drinking, lots of drunkenness, really, lots of carousing, some sexual freedom that would have been inappropriate in the Pilgrim community. All of that going on. They sold rifles to the Native Americans, and of course the Indians, when the conflicts arose, they would use them against the Puritans, and so finally the Pilgrims had it. They had had enough of Thomas Morton and the Marymounters, and so they sent out Miles Standish, their military man, the voice of force that they did have, although he got them in big trouble sometimes with the interface with the Indians. But nevertheless, they sent him out, and he crushed this uprising, the Marymounters. Now listen to this. This is let's see what we've got here. We got. This is Nathaniel Hawthorne. That's the maypole right there. That's a depiction, again, a 19th century painting of the maypole of Marymount. And if you look closely at the picture, it's a lot of, just wildness. I mean, they were just wild. And so here's the way Hawthorne in 1836 depicts this story that Bradford writes about. Bradford writes about it from the Puritan perspective. Hawthorne is writing about it, looking back and saying, what do we make of this? What does this story tell us about the future of America? And I think it's an important question to ask. He says, jollity and gloom were contending for an empire. So the light and the dark here. I mean, he's going to put it all into this bigger, larger perspective. Not far from Marymount was the settlement of Puritans, most dismal wretches. These are the Puritans, he calls them. This is Hawthorne now. These most dismal wretches who said their prayers before daylight. When they met in conclave, it was never to keep up the old English mirth of maypoles and such things like that, celebrating and drinking together and so forth. No, it was gathering to hear sermons 3 hours long. The future complexion of New England was involved in this important quarrel. Should the grisly saints establish their jurisdiction over the gay sinners, then would their spirits darken the clime and make it a land of clouded visages, of hard toil, of sermons and psalms forever. He said one of the places we get the beginnings, the beginnings go all the way back to the beginning of the negative view of the Puritans, putting constrictions on people. So if you base your vision on freedom of the individual, you also better be careful, because unlimited freedom of the individual, as we all know, as we know in our time in spades, as we know in our own lives, I mean, abuse of alcohol and the abuse of all kinds of things, all of the sexual stuff that is happening and so forth, the freedom without limitations causes great damage to the life of individuals and to the life of societies. And yet, our tendency is to say, oh, lighten up. Don't put too much constriction on it. Americans cannot stand restrictions on our freedom, on our individual freedom. And yet freedom gets us into big-time trouble, right? And who's the authority to say? That's what we ask today. Who's the authority to say what should limit my freedom? That's a huge question for us, and it happens to this day. It is going on. And here in this conflict between the Puritans, they get the bad. What is it H.L. Mencken says? A Puritan is someone who lies awake at night horrified that someone somewhere is having fun. You know, that's the image, and that's happening right here in the very beginnings. The Puritans come down harsh on the Maypolers. And so they get the image. And so the question is, who wins here? That's the question we live with day after day, is where and how can we put limitations? Where can we put the guardrails for our kids, for our children, in our schools, in our colleges and universities? My goodness, what goes on a campus of colleges and universities, do we need some guardrails? Yeah, we do. We need some, but that's it, but it's the maypole of Marymount. It's do anything. It's individual freedom. It is free. That's what we began with, is freedom. That's what the Reformation is all about, right? So freedom, though, the unintended consequences of freedom, reaching out and causing damage in our lives, how can we buy into the compact, the covenant together, that we'll build a decent society and we will anchor it at the core and at the center with love, with coming together, with caring for one another. The gospel drives us to that conviction and to that action wherever we can, that at the center is love. Yes, and then somewhere out here we also provide some sort of moral framework for our lives, for that community we've created. That's what we're living in. We live with that tension. So, hey, so that's a piece of the story. A lot more could be said, should be said, I suppose, but that's a piece of the story of the beginnings. The Reformation, gone across the Atlantic, and now in these seminal texts, in these beautiful texts, that we can see what it was that really mattered to them. David Hall says some great things. He says, you know, we can deal with them harshly. By the way, I've got a great... we judge the Puritans harshly, and yet we idealize them grandly, and I think that that's what we have done and what we continue to do. But he says, you know, if we judge them, let's judge them by their aspirations, by their standards. That's what we judge them by. As we judge ourselves, we judge us by our own standards that say we've got to put some limits to this individual freedom. Okay, well, let's take 5 minutes here, and then we'll come back, and apparently we've got some goodies over there, and yeah. And then Mark's going to come on.
So I'm going to get us started here, and I think this will work perfectly. I'm going to have a little bit of maybe kind of reviewing some of the things my dad talked about at the start, and then I'm going to get into two things that I think will be new information. I'm going to talk a little bit about Anne Hutchinson and the antinomian controversy, and then I'm also going to talk about the Salem witch trials. And then I'm going to leave at least 10 minutes, I think, for Tom to talk about the model of the Mayflower. So I'm going to move pretty quickly, but I think it's going to work. Okay, so hopefully I won't be going too fast. So I love this idea from Dad that you know, we need to think about the Puritans in terms of their aspirations, and then two, I think that, you know, as we know, almost immediately they start running into some real difficulties. You know, you mentioned the starving time, but also theological disputes. So just, you know, to review a little bit, Dad talked about how this first band of Puritans thought of themselves as pilgrims. They were moving to America from Leiden in the Netherlands, and they were on the Mayflower. So this is a painting that's in the U.S. Capitol by Robert Weir called The Embarkation of the Pilgrims. And it kind of captures that sense of being sort of having this divine purpose and vision for what they were going to do. I have some images here that'll just be great illustrations too for a lot of what my dad talked about. So this is the cover page of William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. And then I have a detail there of the top of William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. This is a photograph of the Living Museum, Plymouth Plantation. Some of you may know it. If you've been there, it's definitely worth visiting. It's one of the great living museums, I think, in the U.S., where the employees are actually dressed up as pilgrims and are sort of living in this. They've kind of recreated this community there at Plymouth, Massachusetts. So then he moved on to John Winthrop and the Puritans, who arrived in 1630 on the Arbella and a number of other ships. He mentioned that there were almost 1,000 of these Puritans or Calvinist dissenters. And they held similar beliefs, obviously, to the Pilgrims, the doctrine of election and other similarities. At the end here, there is a brief mention of Roger Williams, who was banned from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for his unorthodox views. He purchased land from the Narragansett Indians around Providence, Rhode Island, and he's often credited with, sort of innovating this idea of a separation of church and state, which is not at all what John Winthrop and the Puritans were trying to create. It was more of a kind of theocracy almost, where church and state were one and the same. I thought it might be interesting to just show you the Massachusetts Bay Colony seal from 1629. This is what the Puritans brought with them on the journey. You notice that there's an image there of a Native American who is saying, it's a little saying coming out of his mouth, "Come over and help us." Puritans at the time would have recognized that as a quotation from Acts 16, verses 9 through 10. Paul has a vision that appears to him in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." So come over and help us. So he immediately goes into Macedonia and to preach the gospel. So I think that it's clear that part of the message is to come over and form this Puritan community, and I think you did a good job of laying out that vision for us. But another aspect of it was a sort of evangelizing mission as well. So this is the famous image of John Winthrop, which was painted by an anonymous painter sometime during his life in Massachusetts between 1630 and his death in 1649, or maybe a little bit later, but it was said to have been held by the Winthrop family until the mid-19th century, when it was donated to the American Antiquarian Society. So it's an amazing image, I think, of John Winthrop. I won't go into a model of Christian charity speech, because I think Dad did such a great job on that. The famous phrase, "A city upon a hill," there in the middle. The eyes of all people are upon us. I have a friend, Abram Van Engen, who's writing a book on that phrase, and he calls it the beginnings of America. So anyway, I think that's an amazing speech. There's an image from the New York Public Library, I believe from around 1856, of the landing of Governor Winthrop at Salem in 1630. And then I think I'll skip this too. This is a quotation from John Winthrop's journals. And no, I think I'll just comment here that he's kind of acknowledging in this quotation that we are going to run into hazards and difficulties from the get-go. People warned us about it before we left. They tried to dissuade us from going even, and sure enough, we're running into these problems that people warned us about, and yet we move on, right? Yet we trusted in God and went on our way, and the Lord hath preserved us and frustrated all counsels and attempts against us. So there's this sort of hopeful or aspirational quality of, be that as it may, we're going to give it a go. We're going to make this thing work if we can. All right, so that brings us to one of the earliest, difficulties, one of the earliest conflicts that they run into in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that is the Anne Hutchinson affair, okay, or the antinomian controversy. So Anne Hutchinson arrived in Boston, quite early in 1634. She was a follower of and following the Puritan divine John Cotton, who came over as a minister and whose teachings she professed. And so Cotton was opposed to this Arminianism, okay? So the followers of the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius were asking the question, if one's salvation depends solely on grace and there's nothing we can do to affect it or not, then why obey any moral code if God's grace is just what does it? It doesn't matter what we do. And so this was the Arminians who held that there must be a role in Christianity for the human will, that we must have some role in our own salvation. And John Cotton opposed this. Anne Hutchinson was adamantly opposed to this. She held to an antinomian view. So the antinomians, on the other hand, found this idea sinful and Hutchinson, with her vast biblical learning and quick wit, was the most capable among them of expounding the reasons. To teach a covenant of works rather than a covenant of grace was to place fallen man in a position to drive bargains with God, she felt. That Boston preachers should extol human virtue as a road to salvation was literally damnable for her, okay? So I thought I would show you one of John Cotton's sermons in which he expounds on this a little bit, the difference between a covenant of works and a covenant of grace. So here is John Cotton. Now, if we do enter into a covenant to keep the ordinances of the law, of the gospel, and of the civil state, all this may be but a covenant of works. What then must we do? We must fall down before the Lord in our spirits and profess ourselves insufficient to keep any covenant, and profess ourselves unworthy that the Lord should keep any covenant with us, as to say, Lord, who am I? Or what is my Father's house, that the Lord should ever look upon such a poor soul as I am? So the idea being that we're always dependent on God's grace. There's nothing that we can do to change that. And we should never think ourselves sort of worthy or even capable of affecting salvation for ourselves, that it's a gift from God, okay? So what Cotton says is that we have to build the church upon the foundation of faith. If we build it upon any other foundation but faith and the profession of faith, then it will break the church into manifold distempers. But if the church be built upon this rock of faith, then storms and winds will not so much as shake it, it being built upon faith, and faith upon Christ Jesus. By this means the covenant will keep us constantly, sweetly, and fruitfully in an everlasting kind of serviceable usefulness one to another. So that kind of rings true with what you were saying, is this sense of community, but one that is built upon this covenant of grace, okay? So that's John Cotton, who is, by the way, the grandfather of Cotton Mather, who we'll learn about later. Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father, married John Cotton's daughter. So that's the connection there to Cotton Mather. So here's an image of Anne Hutchinson, and this is her preaching in her house in Boston. It's an image from, I think, Harper's Weekly in 1901. But I just wanted to show this to say that, you know, part of the controversy for Anne Hutchinson was not only that, you know, that she was, you know, pretty sure of herself and her views, but also that she was, you know, sharing those with others, and especially the fact that there were men sometimes at these meetings at her house, I think became one of the issues that led to her being censured. There was an examination of Anne Hutchinson at the court at Newtown in 1637, and presiding over this examination or interrogation was none other than Governor John Winthrop. So we see here Governor Winthrop asking her the question, why do you keep such a meeting at your house as you do every week upon a set day? And Mrs. Hutchinson answers, it is lawful for me to do so, as it is all your practices, and can you find a warrant for yourself and condemn me for the same thing? Governor Winthrop, I will say that there was no meeting of women alone, but your meeting is of another sort, for there are sometimes men among you. Mrs. Hutchinson says, there was never any man with us. And Governor Winthrop says, well, admit that there was no man at your meeting and that you was sorry for it. There is no warrant for your doings, and by what warrant do you continue such a course? And here's where I think here's an image of her on trial, Anne Hutchinson, facing down these ministers and governors. She, in fact, bases her defense, not on the idea that she has a right to public preaching. That would be really, I think, taboo. But she thinks that she has a case for scriptural authorization to hold religious meetings in her home, especially if there are no men in those meetings. So the magistrates saw this as a clear violation of social and gender hierarchy, but even more threatening, I think, to the Puritan elders and integral to her banishment from the colony on charges of heresy was not the violation of social order, but rather a strictly theological claim to a kind of prophetic knowledge. And so here in the interrogation, we'll see her make this claim to being directly inspired by God and kind of having this prophetic knowledge and authority to speak. She says, "If you please give me leave, I shall give you the ground of what I know to be true, being much troubled to see the falseness of the Constitution of the Church of England, I had like to have turned separatist, whereupon I kept a day of solemn humiliation and pondering of the thing. I bless the Lord, he hath let me see which was the clear ministry and which was the wrong. Now if you do condemn me for speaking what in my conscience I know to be the truth, I must commit myself unto the Lord." So she really feels strongly that she's been given a vision of what is the true church and what is the false church, as it were. Notice that language about being a separatist. I was going to turn separatist. She's part of this Puritan community, right? So she's trying to reform the church from within, but she's considering going the way of the separatists and breaking off, all right? So that part about claiming that it was a kind of spirit that led her to this certainty, that raises some concerns. So Mr. Nowell says, "How do you know that that was the spirit?" And she answers, "How did Abraham know that it was God that bid him offer his son, being a breach of the sixth commandment?" By an immediate voice is the deputy governor's answer to how Abraham know it. "So to me by an immediate revelation," she says. How an immediate revelation? By the voice of his own spirit to my soul. I will give you another scripture, Jeremiah 26, 27, and 28, out of which the Lord showed me that he would do for me and the rest of his servants. But after he was pleased to reveal himself to me, I did presently, like Abraham, run to Hagar. So you can see how she's kind of very feisty here. She's sparring with these ministers and governors and, quoting scripture to sort of back herself up. And this is David Hall again, whom Dad talked about a little bit, a great historian, probably the world's most renowned historian of Puritan New England. But he says, "We may therefore place Anne Hutchinson in the company of other saintly women who, throughout the history of the Christian church, have claimed the authority of inspiration as the one alternative left open to them. Anne Hutchinson proved able to match verse for verse when her interrogators accused her of defying Scripture. But in the end, she rested her empowerment as teacher and prophet on the direct witness of the Holy Spirit." And this is the final quotation I have from her. She says, "And after that, he did let me see the atheism of my own heart, for which I begged of the Lord that it might not remain in my heart, and being thus, he did show me this, a 12-month after, which I told you of before." So here she's admitting that she did have this period of crisis of faith almost, and that the inspiration that she talked about earlier came 12 months after this kind of crisis that she had. Ever since that time, since the vision, I have been confident of what he hath revealed unto me. You have power over my body, but the Lord Jesus hath power over my body and soul. And assure yourselves thus much, you do as much as in you lies to put the Lord Jesus Christ from you. And if you go on in this course, you will bring a curse upon you and your posterity, and the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, when Puritans came to America,
Yeah.
in England they had prophesying meetings.
Yeah.
Did they bring those prophesying meetings to America with them? And was she challenging them on a prophesying meeting type of experience?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I know that there was a lot of interest in Revelation and in what we call millennialism among these, yeah.
Well, I mean the meetings where...
Yeah, where people prophesied.
Well, no, it wasn't that. They called them prophesying meetings.
Yeah.
But they just got together and each one gave their Sunday sermon.
Ah.
Listened to each other's sermon and then determined what the will or direction of God was. By
Interesting.
mutual understanding, not a single person's
That's
view. Here
interesting.
they're rejecting a single person's view.
Yeah.
But also
Yeah.
they're stamping that out rather than letting that be part of the community's message.
Interesting, yeah.
Because she's a woman.
Probably because
But
she's
I
a
don't know
woman.
if did they listen to one another?
Sure. That's a good question. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I just think I'm trying to show here, part of what I'm trying to do too is sort of let these historical figures speak for themselves a little bit. And, you know, I think what we hear her doing here is kind of challenging them, you know, right where they live, so to speak. You know, it's sort of like right at the heart of, you know, their doctrines. She's kind of going right to that.
We just finished 7 hours on Juana Inez.
Yeah.
The same period
Oh,
in
yeah.
South America.
Yeah.
Where she had an IQ of like 200 and whatever.
Yeah,
And at 5 years
fantastic.
old, spoke 5 languages.
Wow.
Translated Latin and Greek.
Yeah.
But the authorities didn't particularly value her gift.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah,
Kill her. You know.
that's great. All right, so I want to move to the Salem witch trials here and see if we can learn something about those. But just if I can do this real quickly, Dad talked about Nathaniel Hawthorne. We're both trained in American literature, so I couldn't help bringing Nathaniel Hawthorne into this as well. Because, of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne was, here he is, fascinated with Anne Hutchinson. He wrote an essay about her in 1830, well before he wrote The Scarlet Letter. But he basically, I'll just read the first sentence. Mrs. Hutchinson was a woman of extraordinary talent and strong imagination, whom the latter quality prompted to stand forth as a reformer in religion. So it's very interesting that he had this kind of long-standing fascination with Anne Hutchinson and with the Salem witch trials, of course, because his ancestor had been one of the judges, Judge Hathorne, in the Salem witch trials. So the Scarlet Letter is often, I mean, it refers to Anne Hutchinson twice. And so here's the first one at the very outset of the narrative. For some reason, that got a little bit smaller on us, but you see in the middle of this quotation that the rose bush outside the prison where Hester Prynne is being held had sprung forth under the footsteps of the sainted Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door. So it's almost like Hester Prynne, I think, is being kind of compared to Anne Hutchinson as a religious dissident, if you will, who is challenging the religious authorities of her day. So there's another photograph of Hawthorne by the great 19th century photographer Matthew Brady. And here's the other passage much later in the novel where Hawthorne says that had it not been for Pearl, the Hester Prynne's daughter, she might have come down to us in history hand in hand with Anne Hutchinson as the foundress of a religious sect. Okay, so that's Hawthorne's view of her. But I end here with a quote from literary critic Christopher Caldwell, which basically talks about how, you know, she's obviously been seen as a kind of precursor to our ideas about tolerance, that she was, that her views were not tolerated by the Puritan authorities and that she was banished. But he's arguing that, she was a menace to their society because she was attacking their theological roots, and that she really was kind of advocating for a sort of theocratic extremism, if you will. It wasn't like she was advocating for freedom of speech, or toleration of different views. Do you see what so it's just a slight kind of revisionism of not necessarily seeing her as a martyr of this Puritan, kind of regime. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so moving on to the Salem witch trials, and we don't have a lot of time here because I do want to give Tom a chance to talk about. Yeah, okay, great. So, boy, what to do with the Salem witch trials? One of the, I guess, we all know about the Salem witch trials, so I'm just hoping to kind of give you guys a little bit of sort of information or tools for thinking about them. One thing I guess I'm trying to do too is to get us to think just a little bit about how these Puritans were somewhat unlike us, and that their worldview and the way they saw the world, I think, was somewhat strange from us. And I think here maybe I'm kind of looking ahead and anticipating what we might be talking about later in this series about secularization and the sort of secular world that we live in. This was not a secular world by any means. And so David Hall here again is emphasizing the ways in which, for the colonists in early America, as for their European contemporaries, the natural forces at work in the everyday world were overlain by and interwoven with these moral, spiritual, and supernatural forces. The most powerful force of all was the supernatural. God's providence accounted for everything that happened in everyday life. So events that we consider merely natural, like a thunderstorm, were charged with meaning as expressions of providence and were open to interpretation as signs of God's judgment or his protecting mercy. Similarly, the physical and the moral were very much intertwined. So if someone became sick or his children became sick, it was common to think that it was somehow God's judgment on his not living rightly or properly, okay? So that's just by way of introduction that, there were all these assumptions that they were making that the supernatural and the natural were very much sort of intertwined, okay? So here he talks about the wonder, and he's getting this word from Cotton Mather, of course, who wrote this book, The Wonders of the Invisible World, which is a sort of account of all these manifestations of, the supernatural going on all around them, okay? So let's see. So let's look at this figure, Cotton Mather, a little bit. Again, I was going to try to give him a chance to sort of speak for himself somewhat. So I'll try to take you through, some of the kinds of things that he is saying about these sort of supernatural phenomena. So Cotton Mather, found he was very interested in people being possessed or kind of possessions, and he was a student of them. So in this case, Martha Goodwin was one of 4 children of this Mason, John Goodwin, who started having these symptoms. All right, and so Cotton Mather actually took her into his house and kind of was trying to cure her of these through prayer and fasting. And this talks about how this came about. I think I'll skip through this and get more to the Salem witch trials. This is, you see there, it's 1688, so it's one of the precursors to the Salem witch trials. Because of Martha Goodwin accusing this Irish laundress of stealing linens, and then her mother kind of cursing her. The mother ended up getting executed for witchcraft, okay? Which she actually confessed to, interestingly enough, this Irish Catholic woman named Mary Glover, okay? So she was one of the victims of the witch executions before Salem, before the outbreak at Salem. So let's see. The fits that the children experienced continued even after the execution, though. And Cotton Mather describes this whole episode with Martha Goodwin in his book, Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions. He wrote this book at age 26. It made him famous all over the world, actually. But it's an early example of his writings about witchcraft. And so this is a quote from him about the Mary Goodwin affair, okay? So skipping forward, there was another young girl named Mercy Short, who he also brought to live with him. She had been abducted by the Indians in northern New England, and she also started showing signs of possession. So I'll skip Mercy Short. He writes about her, by the way, in this short excerpt that's in the American Antiquarian Society that he never published, in part because it was right around the time that people were starting to have real doubts about the Salem witch trials that were happening simultaneously. So this excerpt was never published, but was an account of Mercy Short and his doings with her, okay? And then there was one other woman that I was going to talk about named Margaret Rule, but I'm going to kind of, I think, skip forward here to his book, Wonders of the Invisible World, published in 1693. And this basically is a kind of blow-by-blow account of the witch trials at Salem. And, okay, so one of the things I want to emphasize here is that Cotton Mather and others as well was really conflicted about the trials in some ways. Although he was trying to defend them and he felt that there really was, the devil really was at work in what was happening, he also worried that they were basing the convictions on what was called spectral evidence, okay? So he, you see him kind of going back and forth on this, kind of worried that, that some of the convictions might be wrongful convictions, right? So we'll see that a little bit in these excerpts. He acknowledges here that one of the most unaccountable things about the witch, what witches do is that they have this trick of rendering themselves invisible, okay? And so if they're invisible, how do we tell, that they're doing something to someone else? Does that make sense? So there's an image of the trials. This talks about the problem of spectral evidence, okay? The core of many prosecutions had been sightings of activity by the spectral shape of one or another suspect. So it's not the actual person afflicting, the accusers, but the ghost of that, of the one being accused, okay? So that was a problem, and Increase Mather, I think, saw this problem of using spectral evidence. He was against it. He said we have to have, physical evidence in order to get the conviction, in order for the convictions to be valid. The other thing that Increase Mather said, interestingly enough, and this is again Cotton Mather's father, he said that a witch would never be able to recite the Lord's Prayer. So if the accused could do that, then it must mean that they're not a witch. Well, the one minister to be executed in the Salem witch trials, George Burroughs, made a point of reciting the Lord's Prayer as they were right before they hung him, right? So, so anyway, that's another aspect of this. So here, this might be worth just looking at briefly. So here's Mather kind of worrying about it, right? I must humbly beg you in the management of the affair in your most worthy hands that you do not lay more stress upon pure specter testimony than it will bear when you are satisfied or have good plain legal evidence that the demons blah blah blah. So here, make sure you have good plain legal evidence, not just spectral evidence, okay? So that's another painting. Okay, and here, an interesting point to make is that contrary to a lot of prior trials of witches where confession would get you convicted and executed, at a certain point in these Salem trials, confession would get you out of being executed. So obviously, this leads to a real problem because once the accused see that if they confess, they're not going to be put to death, then you're going to get false confessions. Do you see what I mean? So I think that was another problem in terms of the legality of all this, is that the confessions, most, if not all of the confessions were false confessions, okay? Okay, so here's Cotton Mather again saying, we judge that in the prosecution of these and all such witchcrafts, there is need of a very critical and exquisite caution, okay? We need to be very cautious of relying on spectral evidence while also not discounting that, witches can become invisible. Do you see his conundrum is that he really is not going to deny that, but he still thinks that we need better evidence in order to convict people of these crimes. Okay, so I think that just about sort of wraps up what I had for you guys. This is a letter from Thomas Brattle, who was sort of an opponent of Cotton Mather, and he here is like giving voice to the view that, boy, these trials that have gone on at Salem is really a miscarriage of justice. And you can see that he's already doing that in 1692, right? The worst of it is that even as I write to you, that even some of our civil leaders and spiritual teachers who I think should punish and preach down such sorcery and wickedness, yet do yet allow of, encourage, yea, and practice this very abomination. And the abomination is that they're consulting the afflicted children who are making these accusations and taking those accusations way too seriously, when it comes to accusing some of these people, and some of them who were, kind of upstanding citizens, who were very well liked in the community. So a lot of people in the community really started turning against what was happening. And as you probably know, there was, in the aftermath of the Salem witch trials, almost immediately this kind of remorse and guilt for what had happened. One of the judges ended up apologizing and kind of doing penance for his involvement in what happened. Cotton Mather, though, on the other hand, wrote that book where he really tried to sort of justify and defend what had gone on. So I think I will bring it to a close there with maybe this image of the book by Nathaniel Philbrick that Dad mentioned called Mayflower. And I'm pretty sure that painting on his cover is the one that you highlighted for us. And I think that would be a perfect segue to hearing about this beautiful model. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Wow,
You don't need a mic, do you?
yeah, from the solemn Salem witch trials. How's that for a phrase? To the Mayflower itself. The Mayflower was not designed and built to be a prototype for the QE2. You got that? It was designed and built to be a cargo vessel, a merchant vessel, and it spent most of its career moving back and forth between England and Bordeaux. And its hold could accommodate 180 casks of claret wine for the thirsty residents of London. And each one of those casks contained hundreds of gallons of wine. That was its main purpose. It, at length, about 90 feet, the 120 passengers on board were congested in an area 25 feet by 50 feet. 25 feet would be from the edge of the platform to the last row. 50 feet would double that. There was no light. There was very little air because they were confined on what was called the gun deck. There were 3 decks. The main deck, where the captain and his crew guided the ship. The gun deck was the second deck, and part of that was taken up by these 120 passengers. And then the cargo deck down below that, which contained all of their clothing, their food, their implements for farming, and their weapons. What else can I say about this? A question? Did I hear a question? Roger, you look like you want to ask a question. Yes, of course it was incredibly cramped. Some of the families actually built a kind of a cabin for themselves out of spare wood. It didn't give them much privacy, but it helped. 65 days crossing because these superstructures on the prow and the stern kept it from sailing against the wind. And because they left, remember that these 120 passengers were supposed to be on 2 vessels. They were supposed to be on the Mayflower and the Speedwell. But when they left Plymouth on those 2 vessels, the Speedwell leaked, and they had to turn around and come back. And so it was another month before they finally left Plymouth. A month on the gun deck, below the main deck, before they ever set sail. And so what should have taken about a month to cross the Atlantic took 2 months. The Mayflower then stayed in Massachusetts Bay, in Massachusetts Bay, in Plymouth Bay, until May the following year, and then returned to England, and then came back at least once or twice. So it came back as a merchant vessel, because the majority of the people who sailed on the Mayflower were not separatists, they were not pilgrims. They were people who were contracted to London merchants. And those London merchants sent them to the New World to send back furs and other products for the benefit of those merchants. And so the Mayflower came back at least once, maybe twice, in order to carry products back to England. The Mayflower II, how many of you have been on board the Mayflower II at Plymouth? Oh, you must go. You must go. But don't go before 2020 because she's not there. She's being retrofitted and repaired at Mystic Seaport in Connecticut because she was built in 1965 and she was rotting. And so they're rebuilding it from the inside out. And if you go to Mystic Seaport in Connecticut, we were there last summer, you can see the stern and the prow. That's all you can see, because there's a huge tent over the dry dock where she is berthed, and they're just tearing her apart and rebuilding her. But she will sail back to Plymouth in 2020 for the 400th anniversary of the sailing in 1620. And with that, I'm done.